By the way, we hired a new position.
Oh, good.
Good morning, everyone. This is Margie Tatro with GridWorks, along with my colleagues Deborah Shields from GridWorks and Arthur O'Connell from the PRC, hosting this July 14th meeting of the New Mexico Advanced Inverter Working Group. It's 10:30. We're going to give another minute because I know folks are still signing on, but thank you so much for being here. And we're really excited to have Bob Fox from the SunSpec Alliance here to share his insights when we get there. So thank you, Bob, for joining us. And we'll give it just a minute before I turn it over to Arthur and we review the agenda and get opening comments from him. Well, it's looking to me like we have a critical mass of excellent representation for our working group meeting. So I think we'll go ahead and begin this morning. First of all, again, welcome. You'll see on your screen the agenda for today's meeting. After any update on proceedings that are in the works at the PRC, we'll also talk about the two documents that are in draft for this group, both our working group report, which is due September 16th to the New Mexico PRC, and the proposal that has been being worked on by the subgroup for the categories, functions, and settings. Both of those are in draft. Then the meat of today's meeting is a discussion with Bob Fox, who I'll introduce in a few moments, but we're really excited to have him hear from the SunSpec Alliance. Bob's been very active in this area, both in California and around the country, and we're glad to have him today. Then we'll quickly talk about the subgroup that has either volunteered or has been volunteered to help write a proposal regarding communications and interoperability proposal for our final meeting. And then the schedule of meetings will be discussed at the end, where we're going to spend July really here focused on the communications protocols. We'll spend August reviewing the group's recommendation report, and then we'll finalize that in early September. So before I turn the meeting over to Arthur O'Donnell to provide any insights and updates, are there any questions about today's agenda? Okay, hearing none. Arthur, let me turn it over to you to provide any updates.
Good morning, Margie, and good morning, everyone. Thank you so much again for joining us. Honestly, I don't have a whole lot to report. This appears to be the time in the calendar at the PRC when everybody goes on vacation. You should know that there was a change in the chair for the commission as of July 1st. Based on a decision that was made in January. Commissioner Hall is now the chair, and Commissioner Maestas has moved into the co-chair role. So that it doesn't have a major effect on things, except that Commissioner Hall is on vacation. And so we're waiting to hear kind of how she wants to address the last 6 months of this particular seated commission. I know that yesterday's agenda had an item for discussing the 2022 work plan and talk about any updates. That was deferred until next week. So if you're interested, you might want to tune into the next week's meeting, which will not be on Wednesday, but will be on Thursday because so many people are traveling, including myself. I will be down at the NARIC summer meeting in San Diego, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, and early Wednesday. So I'm going to kind of be out of pocket, but there's nothing going on. With regards to particular proceedings, the record, as we mentioned last time, the record in the interconnection phase 1 rulemaking has been closed. The Office of General Counsel has all the materials and is beginning to draft an order. And I have no idea where they are in that process, but hopefully we'll be talking about that pretty soon. On the community solar front, this week, the rule was supposed to be formally published, and I haven't heard otherwise, so it ought to be in effect now. That triggers a bunch of things, including 60 days from the publication date. The utilities will be filing tariffs for the solar bill credit. We've already tried to give a preview of what that looks like in the workshop. If you have an interest, you could go, and the recording of the workshop from June 13th is still available on the Commission's website. And it's later in the program. It was in the afternoon, but each of the 3 utilities presented essentially what their expectations are for what the solar bill credit looks like and how it was derived. But that will be formalized in tariffs. We have also received notice of a challenge to the final order from SPS Utility at the State Supreme Court. They filed just their kind of notification that they were going to be challenging it. I haven't seen anything since. That's on my agenda for today to see if we have any information about what it is that they're challenging. Other than that, the grid modernization program is drawing to a close, and next Thursday will be a presentation from the GridWorks folks on their thinking in terms of the important elements that were raised during the 10 weeks of webinars that we've been holding since March, and their recommendations to the Commission on how to structure a rulemaking for grid modernization. It's going to be a work in progress. I don't expect things to happen overnight. We would hope to see an actual draft of a NOPR hopefully in late September. So maybe the Commission can act on it this year, but I'm not holding my breath on that. So that's really kind of what's going on at the Commission now. I know that yesterday the Commission made a hiring offer to a new head of the Utilities Division staff, guy named Ed Rilkoff from Massachusetts, who has many years of experience and is anticipated to come and take over for John Reynolds, who has recently retired, maybe mid-August. So a lot of things are kind of in limbo right now. If anybody has any questions that I can possibly answer, this is a good time to ask them, and I'll tell you whether I can answer it or not.
Hey Arthur, this is Kevin. Just curious, do you know where one would look to see if the community solar rules got published or not? I spent a little bit of time Googling around yesterday and just couldn't ever find where I'd even look to confirm that.
Yeah, I posed that question to our general counsel and haven't gotten a response yet, but I'll let you know. And I'll also, I mean, if people have an interest, we'll just send out an email to folks that are on the community solar distribution list, right? And that should cover everybody that has a major concern. I really don't know.
That'd be great. Appreciate that. And then as far as the SPS appeal, my understanding is their statement of issues list is due 30 days from the notice. So that would presumably be tomorrow or Monday. Just a heads up there.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of things we'd like to see from SPS, and I don't know when they're going to happen. So, all right. And then, just finally, the commission is in negotiations with the program administrator that we've selected, and would hope to have a contract with that person in place this month. And that will help trigger a lot of other things too. We really want to get the program administrator on board before we make certain kind of timing decisions about what's going to happen in the actual implementation of community solar. So hopefully I'll have more information the next time we meet. Margie?
Great. Thanks, Arthur. Any other questions for Arthur at this point? Okay, well, they will move on. As I mentioned in the first part of the meeting, we've got a proposal, well, two documents that are in the OneDrive site, both an outline of this working group's draft report and also the latest version of the proposal from the subgroup on categories, functions, and settings to comply with the new IEEE 1547 2018 adoption. So I'm asking that anybody who has comments on either of those documents to get them to me as soon as possible. I will take comments on the subgroup's proposal through the end of July, and I prefer that in red line form. Can also send that out to all of you directly along with the meeting summary for today so that you've got it close at hand in Word format. So thank you for your input on both of those topics. Now I'd like to turn the meeting over to Bob Fox, and Bob is the principal engineer at the SunSpec Alliance. He has volunteered or been willing to talk with us today about his insights and experiences regarding the three eligible protocols that are defined in the IEEE standard. The three being the IEEE standard 2030.5, which I'll note seems to be the direction that the California state and working groups and such are adopting as the default standard there. The IEEE standard 1815 and the SunSpec Modbus. So Bob has been at SunSpec for about 10 years, I believe, Bob, and he's helped evolve the conversation around smart inverters and smart inverter working group, Rule 21 in California. He has also been involved in developing and implementing the IEEE 1547 standards. He's spent over 30 years, the way I calculate it, Bob, in the whole area of software, controls, power systems, standards development, just a wide range of expertise areas that are relevant to this. And we hoped that the access to Bob through this meeting would allow all of us to increase our knowledge about these protocols and ask questions and become more knowledgeable about all three. So I will turn it over to Bob and ask that each of you, if you have questions of any sort about these protocols, please either put them in the chat or raise your hand after Bob has done his initial discussion, and then we'll just engage in a conversation about that so that we can become more knowledgeable about this. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn the meeting over to Bob. I don't know if you have your camera available, Bob, and we could see your smiling face. If not, we'll listen to your fabulous voice. So over to you, Bob. Again, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks, Margie. No, I actually don't have my camera available today, so you'll have to stare at my name instead of my face.
So
yeah, it's good to be with everybody. I don't have a formal presentation. I am going to just do a high-level overview of each of the three protocols associated with 1547. and then we can discuss anything that you would like to. So I'd like to keep it informal along the way as well. So as I'm describing the overview, please feel free to ask questions along the way as well. I'd like to keep the whole thing informative, but informal. And I'll provide pointers along the way of where to look for more information for each of the protocols, because each do have their own domain to find the information. Yeah, just to give you a little bit of background in terms of my experience in the DER space, I was vice chair of 1547 2018 and worked on interoperability. So I'm familiar with the choices that were made there and why they were made. So we can discuss that as well. And I think one of the main questions on many people's mind is, why are there three? Why not just one or two? So after I go through the introduction, then we can talk about that, because I think it will be clearer why there are currently three. I also participate in 23.5 activities heavily, as does Sunspec. So Sunspec obviously handles the Sunspec related, protocol related content, but Sunspec is also heavily involved in 23.5, and Sunspec actually provides CSIP certification. So CSIP is Common Smart Inverter Profile for 23.5, and that's what California has standardized on for its 23.5 requirements. Sunspec has a CSIP certification program, so we're heavily involved in 23.5 content, and the next revision of 23.5 is being worked on, and I'm part of the 23.5 working group there as well. So very familiar with what's going on in 23.5, so we can discuss things related to that as well. And then relative to DMP3 and the DMP3 DER application note, I did work on the application note when it was being created, and have participated in that in the specific DER portion of that. So I'm able to answer questions about that as well. So those are the three. Let's go through each one of them in a little bit more detail. So first, I'll start with Sunspec Modbus. Modbus is an industrial control protocol that was created during the late 70s, early 80s, and is a fairly simple protocol that is used in millions of devices around the world, primarily for industrial automation, and has been for a long time. Because of it's fairly simple to implement. Most industrial equipment historically has supported Modbus in some way, and typically, so the Modbus model is a command response model. So a requester, a client, makes requests to a Modbus compliant device to get information from the device. And Modbus devices are organized as a set of registers. So Modbus itself doesn't specify any information to be exchanged. Modbus is just a mechanism for exchanging information. And without somebody supplying the information that is in the Modbus implementation, there's nothing there. So Modbus is the vehicle for exchange, but you have to add the content. And historically, the way the content is added is manufacturers would create their own Modbus content, and that's typically called a Modbus map. And every manufacturer of equipment would create typically a unique Modbus map for their equipment, and maybe even different Modbus maps for different types of equipment within that manufacturer's product line. So interacting with the Modbus device was really acquiring the Modbus map and then setting up your system to be able to deal with that. So kind of a custom engagement on a device by device basis. The idea at SunSpec, so SunSpec started over 10 years ago. At that time, many manufacturers supported Modbus, many DER manufacturers or solar inverter manufacturers at the time. And the idea was, okay, for those that, and many didn't support Modbus actually. Many had their own proprietary protocols at that time. But Modbus was very popular. So the idea behind SunSpec was, let's use Modbus to create a set of standardized information models within Modbus so that devices could standardize on a single Modbus content. And the way SunSpec did it was to divide the functionality up into logical groups to essentially create Modbus submaps that could be defined by manufacturers and chosen in terms of what they wanted to implement. So SunSpec not only has Modbus content associated with inverters and inverter control functionality, it also has environmental device maps, metering maps, tracker maps, energy storage maps. So SunSpec has a wide array of information models that can be used to construct a Modbus implementation. And that SunSpec provides a discovery mechanism so manufacturers can choose which of these submaps they want to use. And then through the discovery mechanism, you can find the location of those submaps so that different manufacturers can implement different content. But as long as they do it in the standardized way, something that understands how to do SunSpec discovery can still find that content. And so at the SunSpec level, even though devices may have different content in them, they're still compatible in terms of an accessor can find the information it needs within the SunSpec Modbus content. So that's SunSpec uses standard Modbus, so there's nothing special. SunSpec is just information models on top of standard Modbus. So the SunSpec, there's nothing special about SunSpec Modbus. It's just SunSpec is providing the information model content that is delivered through the Modbus protocol. Now, Modbus has two different physical mechanisms that people typically use. One is RS-45, which is a serial layer, physical layer, that is still commonly used today. It's inexpensive to implement and easy to wire. So I think it's still pretty prevalent. And Modbus TCP, so Modbus over TCP/IP is the second mechanism for interacting with Modbus. And that uses just standard IP networking. So Modbus over TCP can be routed and can have all the properties that an IP network can provide. So that's SunSpec Modbus in a nutshell. To get information about SunSpec and SunSpec Modbus, you can go to sunspec.org. We have a lot of information about SunSpec Modbus in general, but also specifically about SunSpec Modbus for 1547, because I think that's what most people are here to learn about and to implement or utilize. So there's some specific documents about SunSpec as it pertains to 1547, both the requirements for being SunSpec compliant for 1547 2018 and some implementation information to help understand SunSpec Modbus in the 1547 context. So I'll stop there. Any questions about SunSpec or SunSpec Modbus? as it relates to 1547.
Bob Arthur O'Donnell here, and you can defer answering this question until after you go through
Sure.
the other protocols. But back when California was beginning its conversation about things, I worked at the CPUC, and several of my engineers were skeptical about Modbus on the basis of cybersecurity protection. So when you get there, if you can address that.
Okay, well, I'll touch on it now so you people can think about it, but we can pull it together. So there's kind of two elements associated with that. One is physical, the physical environment. So cybersecurity, obviously, there's the networking component of cybersecurity, but there's also other aspects of cybersecurity in terms of security in general. And many times the Modbus environment is contained physically. So Modbus, a very common pattern is to use a gateway to translate from, say, 23.5 to Sunspec Modbus. And that translation would happen on site and may be physically secured and not network accessible. So that's one aspect to security and protocol security and Modbus security specifically. The second is if you really wanted to extend Modbus over a network that's exposed, there is a specification for Modbus over TLS. So TLS, transport layer security, is the standard security mechanism that is used in association with TCP/IP. So when you go to your secure banking site or are interacting using TCP/IP, as we do every day with most of the things we interact with on a network, TLS is at the bottom of that. So you can run Modbus over TLS, and there's a specification for that if you choose to. Now, the security trade-offs are risk versus reward type things, and Modbus over TLS today hasn't. We don't see a lot of activity in that area, but it's available if somebody wanted to utilize it based on whatever networking topology they were trying to put together. So I think those are the two high-level answers, but we can delve into it in more detail when comparing them all. Okay, let me talk about DMP3 next, because it's similar to Modbus in that DMP3 was developed, I think, in the early 90s. It has a very similar pattern to Modbus in that it's a command response protocol. So in a DMP3 system, there's a requester that is talking to a device, getting information from a device, or sending information to a device. So it makes a request and the device responds, much like Modbus. DMP3 also has a register model, like the model isn't exactly like Modbus, but in the way that Modbus does, DMP3 is just a way of exchanging information. There's no application information associated with DMP3. The application information needs to be supplied on top of DMP3. And DMP3 has its own register paradigm. So I think you could assert that DMP3 adds a richer experience in each of the areas that Modbus relates. DMP3 has more functionality in those areas. So it is more capable in many ways, but also more complicated as well. And so DMP3 has asynchronous. It has the ability for devices to send information asynchronously as an option. It has other features that allow it to add additional functionality, but it has a similar communication paradigm Modbus. So in the 1547 DMP3 context, there's a DER application note that was created to organize information associated with DER within the DMP3 context. So much like Modbus, and a common use for DMP3 over the years has been in SCADA systems. So SCADA systems are data acquisition and control systems that typically provide fairly granular control and have been used by utilities. In utility systems, DMP3, I think, has been a common protocol for larger systems where there's an interest in getting information or having control. And similar to Modbus, each DMP3 system tends to be a custom engagement. Now, with Modbus, a manufacturer usually supplies a Modbus map, and that's what it is. With DMP3, it's often more flexible than that. That manufacturers can supply their DMP3 content, but it's often very configurable. And so that DMP3 can be even more custom engagement. And it's usually reserved for systems that have a budget that's appropriate for setting up these kind of typically higher speed communications, and where there is a control link needed to manage the system. So often custom work and higher budget activities are associated with DMP3. Now, it doesn't always have to be that way, but these are the kind of systems that are typically deployed in. As I said, the context for 1547 is the DER application note. That's available from the dmp3.org users group. I think they're the ones managing the application note. I will also mention the MESA Alliance, which is Modular Energy Storage Association, I think it stands for. So MESA has a DMP3 protocol specification. Well, they actually have a couple of pieces, but at the DMP3 level, they have a DMP3 protocol specification that is harmonized with the DMP3 application note. So the context for DMP3 within 1547 could be associated with the MESA DMP3 context, because it is DER application note compatible, and so it can operate within the 1547 context. I think that's an important thing to think about with DMP3, because there are probably a lot of DMP3 systems out there that are connected to utilities, and those DMP3 systems aren't 1547-2018 compliant, most likely because they've been set up with their own DMP3 context. So just because something is DMP3 doesn't mean that it's automatically 1547-2018 compliant. The application note content also needs to be considered in that context. Okay, I'll stop there. Any questions about DMP3? I think this is the one that gets the least attention today in discussions, and I think is primarily associated with larger storage systems at this point. So just to sort of high level characterization of its usage, but I think it's probably of interest to many utilities because of their activities with DMP3 already. Okay, the last one in 1547 is IEEE 2030.5. 23.5, its history, it started out in the Zigbee organization as an extension to their Smart Energy Protocol. So Zigbee had a Smart Energy Protocol 1, it's called, to distinguish it from 2, which is 23.5 today. Zigbee had a metering protocol that was used to communicate with Zigbee meters. And when they updated that to create Smart Energy Profile 2.0, and you'll hear the term SEP2, people, you don't hear it so much anymore, but for a while people used SEP2 and 23.5 interchangeably, because 23.5 is SEP2, is its origin, and SEP2 is easier to say. But now people seem to be getting used to 23.5, so you don't hear SEP2 too much anymore. But SEP2 was developed by Zigbee starting around 2010, and the idea was to create an updated protocol, a home area protocol to manage smart energy devices within a home area network was the target. And it used the latest networking technology. So it uses TCP/IP, HTTP over TCP/IP, and it uses a RESTful web service paradigm. So for those of you that don't know what those things are, they're pretty much what you use every day when interacting with things on the internet. TCP/IP is the basis of it. HTTP is the application layer that allows the information to flow. And the RESTful paradigm, the way HTTP is done, is by far the most common way web services are implemented in the internet today. So 23.5 uses a very standard modern networking stack in order to accomplish its objectives, which I think is appealing to many, because not only is it proven, well-worn, there are many engineers out there that understand it and are capable of working with it. So it's a good match. That's one thing about Modbus and DMP3, that it's getting harder and harder. Engineers are less familiar with it and more familiar with modern networking technologies. So 23.5 is appealing from that perspective. So SEP2 was developed to be the next home area network technology in terms of being able for smart appliances to exchange information. It was once it was developed in the home area arena, there wasn't a whole lot of activity. It was transferred to IEEE in 2015, and that's when it became IEEE 23.5. So this enabled it to have a broader scope, since it was no longer attached to Zigbee from a protocol perspective. I think it made more sense to have it in a place where it could be more accessible from a participation point of view, and so it became IEEE 23.5. That was IEEE 23.5 2015. A revision was done in 2018, and one of the primary objectives of that was to support everything that was in 1547 2018. So 23.5 is capable of supporting all the functionality in 1547 2018. Because of the nature of the technology, it is, even though it was developed as a home area networking solution, because it's TLS, HTTP, standard networking technology, using it over the wide area is not a big stretch. And so in the DER space, I think one of the reasons that it was chosen in this space is it already had DER content developed for it. So 23.5 has many different submodules within it, DER just being one of them. It has metering, it has demand control, pricing. There's a number of different elements that have functional models within 23.5. And in the 23.5 case, the information models are actually contained within the protocol as being opposed to having been added from the outside. So the fact that Modbus and DMP3 need some information models be applied to them, 23.5 contains the information models for each of the function sets, as they're called in 23.5, and outlines the functional behavior for each of those within the protocol itself. So 23.5 is self-contained in that way. The other thing that is different about 23.5 than Modbus and DMP3 is the pattern, the interaction pattern. DMP3 is not a command and control protocol. It is the client acquires its controls from the server. So the way that you would configure a client, a DER, let's say, is you would put the resources on the 23.5 server associated with that client, and the client would acquire the resources from the server. So clients periodically look for updates from the server, or they can be notified from the server. So there's two mechanisms for clients acquiring new control information. One is to keep asking. The other is for the server to let the client know there's new control information, and then the client will go get it. So from a general pattern perspective, the 23.5 pattern is a little bit different than Sunspec Modbus and DMP3. So I'll stop there. And as Margie said, and it's probably most people know, California has made 23.5 the standardized, the default standard protocol for interfacing to utilities in California. And there are several documents that describe that. The CSIP document, Common Smart Inverter Profile, is the one that defines how 23.5 should be used in California. So I would encourage everyone to look at that if you're interested in this. That forms the basis of the certification testing and all the requirements associated with interconnecting in California. Now, California is still going through pilot programs, so it's still early days in terms of deploying this. But Australia also is adopting CSIP. So there's a CSIP Oz discussion that's happening now to create, Australia wanted a few extensions to CSIP, and so that process is happening, but they're another example of a fairly large constituency going with 23.5 as being the standard way of interfacing to utilities. So I'll stop there. And you can get information about all of this on the Sunspec website as well.
So thanks, Bob. I'm going to jump into some of the questions that were posed in chat and start that discussion. First, Leon asked from PNM asked, who's typically responsible for cybersecurity in this communication between the inverters and utility? And Arthur asked the question about cybersecurity for the Modbus protocol. Can you talk in general about who is responsible for the cybersecurity between these systems? Or Leon, do you want to add any information before Bob responds?
Okay, well, I can just take that one. Well, that's a very complicated discussion and one that's happening in California right now, in terms of responsibility. And
Okay.
several models have been put forward. The California IOUs have made several presentations about where they think their sphere of responsibility ends and third-party responsibility begins. But I think the short answer is it's still really there's a lot of detailed discussion about this because everybody's responsible for their own system, but there's obviously a whole here that all has to work properly for any of it to be useful. So addressing the whole, I think, is the challenge, right? I think everyone can agree that they want to be responsible for their own equipment. I think people are reluctant to allow others to control their equipment, but at the same time, there's a partnership here that needs to happen to make it all work. And the fact that it's critical infrastructure compounds it, because obviously this stuff has been worked out many times in terms of banking and other things that equipment owned by different people communicate successfully in a secure way. But the fact that there's a critical infrastructure piece to it, I think, also influences the discussion significantly. But in general, I think people want to use the standard mechanisms because the thing about security and cybersecurity is it's a moving target. And if you try to do anything specialized where you don't have the resources to really burn something in, it's going to be insecure probably. I mean, the people will find a way. So using standardized techniques in standardized ways that have been proven typically is a good foundation. But in terms of spheres of responsibility, I think that is still very much an active discussion, and I think is going to be probably dependent on the different system types too. I think one of the things, and this is just my personal opinion, one of the things that is a barrier, that's been a barrier to some of these discussions, is treating all systems in the same conversation. Because obviously residential systems are very different than large scale generation systems or even medium scale generation systems. And it seems like there's been an attempt to talk about this stuff uniformly. And I think the answer in some of these areas is going to be specific to different contexts. And they're going to have different answers for different contexts because of the risk reward aspect of it. But there's no doubt that millions of small systems add up to a large system. It's just a question of are the vulnerabilities the same for 1 million small systems versus a large system of the equivalent size, one large system of the equivalent size. I think the dynamics of those two situations are fundamentally different, probably, from a security perspective. So I don't think that helped much, but I think it's still a lot of discussions going on in that one.
Right. So it sounds like there is no one clear answer to that. It may be different in different jurisdictions, and I hear from your point that it's going to involve interaction from a number of different partners in that whole equation.
Yes.
Great. And Leon, I know that John Hawkins, who I think is on the line, has been volunteered to participate on the subgroup for this interoperability discussion. So you may want to chat with him in your office there before that group goes any farther. So that would be what I'd suggest for that.
There's probably one point I should make quickly so a very common pattern from a communication point of view is potentially to use different networking technology locally than over the wide area. So 23.5 to Sunspec Modbus is, I think, going to be a very common pattern. And more generically, wide area to local energy management system to local equipment. So taking protocols out of it, I think the wide area communication to an energy management system that's on site, and then that energy management system's communication to what it's managing may use very different protocols. And so I think it'd be very common to use Sunspec Modbus locally within the system because so many pieces of equipment are implementing it today, and that may change over time, but Sunspec is the easiest way to get compliance today. So most manufacturers are opting for Sunspec Modbus for 1547 compliance, but have also used it historically over the years to communicate with gateways on site very successfully. So replace gateway with energy management system as more items appear on site, storage, EVs, along with generators, that you can. I think the model is going to be local energy management system communicating in some way locally, and then possibly a different way of communicating broadly. And 23.5 seems like the way in California for the wide area communication. The local area communication is out of scope in California in terms of when you hit the DER, what's behind the DER is out of scope. And in California, actually, they allow cloud aggregators. So if you get to an aggregator in the cloud via 23.5, what's behind that is out of scope in California. Now, that not everybody loves that decision. So, there's pros and cons to that. So, but that's the California decision. So, 23.5 is the protocol to interface to the California utilities, but there is still within the networking system of a DER in California, there's still plenty of room for other protocol activity, depending on what topology you've set up.
Great, thanks, Bob. One other topic I'm going to ask you to touch on is the conjunction or the interaction between decisions about this protocol and decisions regarding selecting advanced metering infrastructure, AMI, how those two interface with each other, how decisions that are being made that affect one or the other or both. And it's a complicated question, but could you touch on that connection between these protocols and AMI decisions?
Sure, yeah, it's not an area that I actually know a lot about in terms of the details of what the AMI considerations are. I know historically bandwidth has been a big issue associated with AMI, and I don't know, I would expect that to be changing over time. But that's been one consideration historically that I'm aware of is just bandwidth, and that the AMI solution is different typically or constrained in that respect, in that that the amount of bandwidth available is small relative to maybe other a wide area connection or even local area communications that have a lot of bandwidth locally. So that's a potential mismatch. But in terms of the relationship between AMI and the 1547 protocol environment, I don't really have a lot to add there. I think that's useful.
Okay, all right. But at least knowing that bandwidth is one consideration is helpful. The last question I see in the chat, two more questions, were from Travis asking about reference materials, and I'll take that one. Travis, I've got some links from Bob, and he's mentioned a few more in today's discussion, and I will load those in our OneDrive folder for today. So those will be available for the group. And of course, if anybody on this call has documents that they find being helpful, we'll load those as well. So I'll take care of that action. And then Frank, you had a question about the difference between Modbus versus Secure Modbus. So Bob, do you need more information from Frank about what he's asking? Or
well, I'm assuming Secure Modbus means Modbus over TLS. So there is a specification put out by the Modbus organization. So it's an official specification of running Modbus over TLS. So that would certainly be classified as Secure Modbus. And I think that's probably what you're referring to, or what people would refer to as Secure Modbus, is running Modbus TCP over TLS. So that provides the same, depending on what cipher suites and how you manage your certificates. Obviously, security can break down at any of those places, but done in a secure way, you could achieve the same security over Modbus that you do over any other TCP/IP connection. Because people use Modbus typically locally in constrained, physically constrained settings, that I think is often considered overkill. But these days, if we were mapping, the end-to-end connection and trying to classify its security, you could certainly imagine a scenario where people might want that level of security. Or trying to run, you can run Modbus over the wide area network, and it's been done. So that does offer an option if for some reason you wanted to run Modbus in a more exposed networking environment. You can run Modbus over TLS and have Modbus be just as secure as anything else.
great. I'm sure we could carry this conversation for many more hours, but we've asked for just your hour today, and I wanted to thank Bob for tremendous information. I've taken a lot of notes, and he's pointed out a lot of resources to us. So if there are additional questions, I'm going to ask that you email them to us, and as we get the subgroup that's volunteered to work on the communication protocols together, will enable them to have access to all this information. So on that topic, I thank Travis and Dor from Excel SPS and Mike Ropp from Sandia Labs. And I understand that perhaps John Hawkins, which I don't see him now on the call, but in talking with both Ryan and Philip, I think John has offered to serve on this committee, and I'd like to ask Roberto or Curtis, have you come up with a name from someone from El Paso Electric to participate? This is a fairly short time frame on this group. I'd like the group to try to come up with something before we meet in 2 weeks, at least as a draft proposal. So Roberto or Curtis or Ty, is there somebody from EPE who would be willing to work on this as well?
I'd have to defer to Jerry Delgado.
Good morning, this is Jerry. So I do have one of our communications engineers on the phone with us, so we just need to understand exactly what all we can do to help out, and then we can better facilitate.
So Jerry, will you please put in the chat your phone number and email address so that I can call you directly after this meeting and give you whatever information might be helpful for you?
Sure.
Great. Thank you so much. We think it's extremely, anybody else who's wanting to work on this subcommittee is welcome, but we were very pleased to be able to have each of the IOU representatives on this, because this is absolutely critical that we get your input, your voice, your experience, your questions on this topic. So thanks to all of you for being willing to follow up on this. And once I follow up with Jerry and get a name, then I will likely organize a Zoom meeting for the subgroup within the next week for us to get something down that might be a proposal that can be iterated with the rest of the working group. So with that, we're, oh, thanks, Jerry, for putting your number in there. I appreciate that. Shannon, I see one more question, I think, from you. Yes, I'll definitely provide my notes. I'll have a more extended meeting summary this week than from the last one because of all this information that Bob has shared with us. And then I believe that we are at the close of our 1 hour. I know this has gone by quickly because we've gotten so much great information from Bob. Our schedule of events is to meet again in 2 weeks and hear what the subgroup on the communication protocol has come up with. And then we will spend August really fine-tuning our group, the whole group's recommendation report, which includes the information from the functions and settings proposal, and it will include the information from this subgroup working on the communications protocol. So that's our plan. I want to stop here then and ask if there are questions at this point, and then we'll have Arthur, if you have any final remarks, I'll turn it over to you after we give a moment here for questions from the group. All right, I don't see or hear any new ones. Arthur, anything else you'd like to add?
Yeah, thank you, Margie, and thanks again to Bob. I found that really helpful. It's been a couple of years since I was involved in these kinds of discussions, and things have evolved, I think, in a positive way. I do want to remind people that at least for this kind of portion of trying to move the ball ahead, is that we're not here to recommend that the commission adopt this right now, right? What we really need are a sense of, here are options, what would it take to pursue any of these options for New Mexico, right? You know, I heard a couple of things that tinged me like, well, this one you need a high budget for, okay? Well, that's a factor. This one is, you know, kind of like used with SCADA. If it's obviously kind of something that's in use the DNP3, then we might find a role for it. So don't worry about kind of like making an irrevocable decision in terms of recommendation at this point. What we really want is to have a sense of understanding what each of these protocols might be best at, and what would be appropriate for New Mexico, and what will it take? How long do we think it would take? That's really what the output from this portion of the discussion ought to be, so that the commission knows what next steps to take. Of course, if everybody agrees on one thing or another, that's fine, but that's being hoped.
Thank you, Arthur. And I have put into the chat, make sure it goes out, the YouTube link for this meeting in case any of you wanted to go back and either share some of Bob's remarks with your colleagues or listen to them again. I know I am going to when I'm writing up our meeting summary. So feel free to go there and have that as a resource. It will also be referenced in our meeting summary for today. So with that, I'd like to thank you all for your participation, and we will see you all in 2 weeks from today. Our meeting on the 28th is scheduled for 10:30 to 11:30 again. And I hope you all have a great day. Thanks again.